I get questions sometimes, and sometimes these questions are of general interest. So today I'd like to touch on some of these questions. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. Some of it's going to be pretty deep, and it may be, well, I really didn't want to know that much. But I want you to be exposed to things that are deeper than what most Christians get exposed to. Now first I got a question of whether the books of the Bible were written with the chapter and verse designations. And the answer is no. The biblical manuscripts do not contain chapters and verses. They were developed in the early 1200s by a man who was the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. And he realized that people studying the scriptures needed some way to be able to reference something. Like if you wanted to point out John 3:16, instead of saying, well, you know that place in John where they say that you could just say John 3:16, somebody could go and look, and it would immediately be, you would be able to reference it and look it up. And so he developed this system of chapters and verses. And in the late 1300s, what's known as the Wycliffe Bible was translated into English. That was the first known English translation of the Bible. And the chapter and verse designations that this guy had come up with a couple of hundred years ago were included in there, and it's been sort of traditional ever since. Now, the next question is that in some Bible translations, not all, but in some of them you will run across words that are in italics. And those are words that are not in the Greek manuscripts, but they are added by the translators. Sometimes they add them to make something clear. An example, I just opened my Bible and picked one. There's a verse that says, Jesus called them to him. And the word them is in italics. That means it literally says Jesus called to him. So the translators felt that by the context there, it was clear that Jesus called the disciples to him, so they just put in Jesus called them to him, just to make it read better. You know, keep in mind that ancient Greek was a rudimentary language. They didn't have nearly as many words as the English language has today, and it did not read like modern English. And so to get the translations to read more like modern English, sometimes they'll insert something. It's usually nothing major, like and, but, them, there, or something like that. It usually doesn't change anything. It just makes it easier to read. There are a few things in the Bible, though, where sometimes they put in italicized words, and it does change it. So you're getting somebody's interpretation sometimes. So when I'm reading and I see an italicized word, I always stop and look at it and see if this changes anything. 99% of the time, it does not. Now, another question that I got was related, and I think I've talked about this a long time before, the Godhead. What is the Godhead? From our New Testament reading today, from Colossians, if you go to the one that we use, it says, talking about Jesus, for in him dwells all the fullness of the deity in bodily form. Depending on what Bible translation you use, you may have heard, for in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead in bodily form. And that term is also used in some translations in a passage in Acts and in a passage in Romans. Now, in my life, I always thought, I heard in my life that had to do with the Trinity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And you can just imagine that if you say, well, what's the Godhead? Well, it has to do with the Trinity. What do you think, God? A three-headed God. It has nothing to do with the Trinity. Godhead is originated from an Old English word, God-He, Godheade, and it just means deity or God. It did not mean God head, like a head. Somehow or another, it got moved over to God head, and people say, well, that's the Godhead. Yes, it is not. It is just a reference to deity, to God himself. Was the author of the Gospel of Luke a physician? The answer is that no one knows. There is a reference in the book of Colossians to a man named Luke, and it says that this guy was a physician. It doesn't say that that's the author of the Gospel of Luke, though. And you know, it's not unreasonable to think that there was more than one person named Luke alive. And so just because you say, well, here's the Gospel of Luke, then you see over in Colossians, well, here it says Luke was a physician. But Colossians doesn't identify that Luke as the author of the Gospel. So people jump to conclusions like that and read the Bible all the time. Be careful about making assumptions. Were the Gospels written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who were disciples of Jesus? Well, the first thing you can answer that with is that Luke was not a disciple of Jesus. We don't know who Luke was. But we do know that in the list of the disciples, there was not one named Luke. So technically, that's no. However, to answer the rest of it, and this is where it gets complicated, I thought it would be interesting to look about what we do and do not know about the origin of the books of the New Testament. The history of Christianity up until the turn of the 2nd century, that's the 100s, is a complete blank. Not one thing has survived. No references whatsoever. If you skip up several hundred years from that, you start finding writings that start talking about people in the 100s. And they say that these people in the 100s reference writings called the Memoirs of the Apostles and reference writings by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Most people assume those are references to the Gospels as we have them today. However, we do not have copies of those letters from the 100s that supposedly reference those. What we have are copies that were made hundreds of years later, and these people say that they said that these people back then talked about it. So we cannot be sure that that happened. But even if you give those writings the benefit of the doubt and say that there were mentions of memoirs of the apostles in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the 100s, you have no way of knowing whether those are the same as the ones we have today. They could have been very different back then. In fact, there are scholars who point out valid reasons for thinking that the writings we have in the New Testament did indeed change over the years. That they went through a process of development. So we just don't know. We don't want to base our faith on assumption. As far as copies of the Gospels themselves, there are manuscript fragments of small portions, phrases, that some scholars date to the 100s or early 200s, but other scholars disagree and say they're not that old. Dating those manuscripts is not easy. There's no way to date them with certainty. It is a subjective process. And anytime you have a subjective process, your preconceived notions will affect your decision. Those whose interests are served by wanting to assign an early date will, of course, argue for an early date. Those whose interests are served by date will argue for a later date. From the best I can determine, trying to be impartial, we just don't know. They may be earlier, they may be late, we just don't know. The same is true for the writings of Paul, which comprise the majority of the New Testament outside the Gospels. There are reports coming from hundreds of years after that people in the 100s and 200s mention the writings of Paul, but we do not have those writings. We do not know if that's true. And even if it is true, we do not know if the writings they mention were the same as we have today. There are indications from things that Christians purportedly wrote in the 200s that have led scholars to posit that Christianity underwent a profound change at some point prior to the year 150. And some of the writings that may have existed prior to that, which would include Gospels and letters to Paul, were changed to align them with what Christianity had morphed into. In other words, this theory says that Christianity started out one way and for some reason morphed into something else, and after that the historical record was changed, so to speak, to make it seem like it had always been that way. That would have been very easy to do that then because things didn't survive well and there wasn't a lot of stuff anyway. Now, whether that's true or not, I have read those arguments. Those people that make them are not idiots, and they can put forth some convincing arguments in support of their view. But again, it's one of those things that we just do not know. There's so much that we do not know. We have no idea what Christianity was like in the year 70 or in the year 100. Nothing has survived. Nothing. And so what's happened is the history of Christianity was filled in going back. If we know what things were in the year 350, we fill in the history going back and assume that we know what happened earlier. It's an assumption. And I always try to encourage people, don't build your faith on an assumption. Be aware of what we do not know. So with all that said, let's go back and see if we can see things that we do know. The earliest complete copy of the New Testament, according to some scholars that we have, comes from the mid-300s. It is something called the Codex Sinaiticus. It is in Greek. It contains most of the Old Testament, including the Apocrypha, which is what Protestants call some books that they took out of the Old Testament that Catholics, Episcopalians, and Orthodox use. It also includes two books in the New Testament we do not have, the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. There are other manuscripts that date later. The next complete one is called the Codex Vaticanus. It dates from the later 300s. It's in Greek. It contains also the complete Old Testament and the New Testament. There is some significant differences in the wording of this one though than in the other one. The next is the Codex Alexandrinus. It dates from around the year 400. It adds two books to the New Testament we do not have, 1st and 2nd Clement. In case you're wondering what a codex is, it is a book that has been made by stitching together individual pieces of paper. Now, there is confusion among biblical scholars as to when these things actually existed from. They were not found until the 1800s. Some biblical scholars date them back to the 300s and 400s. Some do not. So what do you do? Now, at some point, beginning around the 300s, remember when the Roman Emperor Constantine made Christianity into an institutional religion and established what would become known as the Church, the language of Christianity shifted from Greek to Latin. because Constantine headquartered his church in Rome, and that was the language of Rome. And as the story goes, once Constantine's church began using Latin, some of the Gospels got translated into Latin. Nothing original has survived, though. That's just the story. But anyway, in the late 300s, a man named Jerome is said to have translated the Gospels into Latin, and other people also collaborated, and they translated the entire Bible, and that became known as the Vulgate. Vulgate just means for common use. And that became the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church, the church that Constantine established. The original of that has not survived. The earliest copies we have date to the 400s. And this is the Bible used in Western Christianity until the Protestant Reformation. Now, in the early 1500s, a man came up by the name of Erasmus, and he believed that over the years, remember they used the Vulgate. Remember there was no printing press back then. If you wanted another copy, you had to set out and write it. And he believed that over the years, as it was copied over and over, that mistakes had crept into it. And so he decided he wanted to go back and correct all those mistakes. So he decided to look at as many old copies of the Vulgate that he could find. He also went to look at some old Greek manuscripts, and it was said that he looked at both Latin and Greek manuscripts going back to the 1100s, and he published a new version. And he said, this is the corrected version. I've corrected all the errors that crept in. And when he published that, he published the Greek right beside it to prove that his version of the Latin was correct. And that was the first printed Greek New Testament. That was in the year 1516. Now, this Greek New Testament that Erasmus published became known as the Textus Receptus. That means received text. And it was later modified as time went on several times. It was last modified back in the 1800s. But it formed the basis of the translations of the Bible into German and English that were undertaken during the Protestant Reformation. The translations by Martin Luther, by William Tyndale, as well as other translations, and notably it served as the basis for the New Testament translation of the King James Version. Now, if you've ever known a Christian that says, I believe the Bible word for word, if you've ever wondered where that came from, that technically refers to the Textus Receptus, because the Textus Receptus, so the received text version, is that which is believed by people who believe word for word the Bible. That is the inspired word of God right there in Greek. And so that's why a lot of these people that believe the Bible word for word will only use the King James Version, because the King James Version was translated from the Textus Receptus. Now, as time went on, of course, the Textus Receptus got changed a couple of times, and all those lumped together are the Textus Receptus. Now, to back up a little bit, we talked about how there were very few surviving Greek manuscripts of the Bible from the early days. But as you get on later, like into the 400s, the 500s, especially on into the 700s and 800s, there are many more that survive. And it turns out that there's 5,800 and something of those things that have been found. And as you might guess, they are not all the same. And so over the years, biblical scholars have been faced with these differences among the various manuscripts that have been found. And they've tried to determine the correct wording. If you have a number of different manuscripts and they all don't agree. How do you know which is correct? One of the first ideas that came out was, well, we'll just go with what most of them say. And so, like, you've got 10 different manuscripts here, and 3 of them say this, and 4 of them say that, and 3 of them say this. We'll go with the one that 4 says, because it's the majority. And that's what's known as the majority text. And there are Bibles, just a few, that are translated from the majority text. But where you will normally encounter references to the majority text is sometimes in your Bible translation, you might have a footnote that they will give you this reading up here, then they will have a footnote, and at the bottom they may say majority text reads so-and-so. That's where they came from. Okay, so the other idea was that instead of just taking the majority reading, we should really think about it and see what to translate it should really be. And so this was called the critical approach. And critical does not mean criticizing. A lot of times when people hear that critical approach to the Bible, they think you're criticizing the Bible. That's not what it means. A critical text is different from a majority text in that when they make a majority text, they just take what the most Greek manuscripts say. A critical text, though, is comprised of a group of scholars looking at the differences, and then they get down and they try to decide why those differences existed. And then they determine by their consensus what they think is closest to the original. That's a critical approach. They take into account different factors and try to decide which is closest to the original. And you can see this is making decisions and opinions, and those change over time. So this version is called the Novum Testamentum in Greek, New Testament in Greek. It was first published in 1898. It's in Greek. It's been changed 28 times since then. And so you can see how people's opinions have changed. Now, these changes have not really altered the religion of Christianity. They're usually minor, insignificant changes. However, it has changed. And that came out in 1898. And versions of the Bible, like the New Revised Standard Version, the New International Version, those are translated from that. It is the King James Version that comes from the Textus Receptus. There is no major version that comes from the majority text, and the Novum Testamentum is behind the Revised Standard Version and New International Version. Most of the differences between all these different versions of the Bible are not significant, but sometimes they are more than minor. Not that they may change Christianity overall, but they're more than insignificant. And depending on what Bible translation you use, if you use something like the New Revised Standard Version, you'll be reading a passage, and then there'll be a footnote thing, and you'll look down the bottom of the page, it'll say other ancient authorities give a different reading on that. So you know that for this particular passage, there is enough difference in the manuscripts that the translators chose one, but felt that they needed to make you aware that the others existed. All translations do not do that. But if you use something like New Revised Standard Version, you'll see that. Now I know this has been a lot to take in, but I wanted you to see that the history and the development of the New Testament is debated by scholars, sometimes hotly debated. We don't really know where these writings came from. We don't really know. Our Bibles were translated at the earliest from things that were developed in the 1500s, 1,500 years after the time of Jesus. By the 300s, some people think we have some stuff that we can point to. Maybe approximately what we have today, maybe not. But the development will continue up until the Protestant Reformation, and even beyond. It continues up today. As I said, the New Testament in Greek is in its 28th edition since 1898, so you can see how it has changed. That's from a historical standpoint. In the end, Christianity is a matter of faith. Christianity is something we cannot prove. And although I try to caution people against making assumptions, I don't ever want to base anything on an assumption. We have to realize that Christianity is primarily based on faith. We do not have an unbroken historical record that goes back to today, all the way to the year 0, from the time of Jesus' birth. We do not have an unbroken historical record that goes from the year 100 to today, or from the year 200 to today, or from the year 300 from today. We do not have historical proof that goes back all that time. So we accept Christianity on faith. And when we read the Bible, we keep in mind that the Bible contains all things necessary for our salvation. It does not contain the answer to all questions. It does not contain everything you ever wanted to know. It does not contain everything about God. It does not contain the answer to all of your problems. It contains all things necessary for your salvation. And that's where a lot of Christians go wrong. It contains all things necessary for your salvation. That's what it is. And that's what we need to keep in mind that it is. All things necessary for your salvation. No more and no less.